Let me just start this lecture by saying that Althusser starts his paper entitled Lenin and Philosophy. Quote, "A scientist is justified in presenting a communication before a scientific society. A communication and discussion are only possible if they are scientific. But a philosophical communication and a philosophical discussion? Philosophical communication. This term would certainly have made Lenin laugh, with that wholehearted, open laugh by which the fishermen of Capri recognized him as one of their kind and on their side. This quote serves two purposes. This quote from question serves two purposes. First, it leads into Althusser's starting point, which I will get to in a second. But it also draws the distinction between science and philosophy, which is the defining point of the paper, and looks not only at Lenin's use of philosophy, but his relation to it. To begin, Althusser relates the position Lenin finds himself in 1908 as a guest of a person named Gorky, who had invited Lenin to discuss philosophical ideas with a group of leftists called the Auschwitz. I hope I pronounced that right. Auschwitz, I think. And I put leftists in quotes here because while they were political leftists in that they were in favor of radical measures and opposed to non-violent means, Lenin regarded them as petty bourgeois philosophers whose organization held rightist theoretical positions. Althusser uses the term fashionable philosophy of imperial criticism, which had been updated in the form they were using by the Austrian philosopher Ernst Mach. Althusser stops at this point in the story to mention a general paradigm shift that occurs both in science and philosophy, and relates it to the shift caused by Mach in his philosophy, which Althusser claims is the philosophy of psychologists and physicists. And this change is one such shift that Althusser will talk about throughout most of the paper. But what Althusser most importantly adds is who is capable of noticing certain aspects of these phenomenon, which he calls, aspects of this moment, he says, which he calls scientific crises. When certain sciences undergo important revolutions, at that time math and physics, there will always be professional philosophers to proclaim the crisis of science or mathematics or physics has begun. He goes on to say that scientists are also capable of realizing these crises of science. But Althusser puts these scientists in a very interesting niche. He says that as soon as the scientists talk of crisis, they find themselves, quote, in a new philosophical vocation, and claims that the scientists who become philosophers believe they are uttering revelations, but are instead repeating what philosophy must regard as part of its history. And it is Mach's philosophy that underwent this type of crisis to philosophy this time. In the same way that Althusser draws the distinction of information theory for biologists during his time with the writing of this, I would say maybe perhaps something like string theory now. Paradigm shifts in the ways that we can view certain sciences. Althusser then makes a very bold statement about these revolutions in science and scientific crises. And that is the fact that they are always oriented philosophically in one and the same direction. They revive and update old empiricist or formalist, i.e. idealist themes. They are therefore always directed against materialism. What did this mean for the Auschwitz? As Bolsheviks, they were Marxists, but as imperiocentrists, they held that Marxism had to rid itself of pre-critical metaphysics, dialectical materialism, and in order to become the Marxism of the 20th century, had to adopt imperial criticism. Gorky's aim was to invite Lenin to talk about philosophy with a group of Auschwitz philosophers, and his reply, in a letter that Lenin wrote to Gorky, writes that I should very much like to see you, but I refuse to engage in any philosophical discussion. So why tell this story? Well, this letter of Lenin's is highly political, and realizing that Lenin at the time knew dividing Bolsheviks was a poor tactical decision, is only one important aspect. The more important aspect goes back to the opening concerning Althusser's major focus on the relationship between philosophy and science. Althusser here uses this reasoning to outline an interesting difference between science and philosophy. He says that science, because of how it is used, unites people. Philosophy, on the other hand, works only as the opposite and divides people. And what Lenin does here is not, I suppose, what you call philosophy proper, but as Althusser titles it, as the practice of philosophy. Going back to the laughter at the idea of a philosophical communication, Althusser says that Lenin's laughter in itself is a thesis, which I thought was rather good. And Althusser lays out what he intends to do for the rest of the paper. He claims that this paper will be a talk in philosophy, but this talk in philosophy will not quite be a talk of philosophy. It will be rather, or rather try to be, a talk on philosophy, which means that by inviting me to present, let's see. completely lost my place. Althusser's language, and he claims that speaking on philosophy in a talk that is in philosophy, he is doing communication. Again, drawing an important distinction between his philosophy and his science. He goes on to say that if his title is correct, or if this title can be correct, he will have succeeded in his communicative task if he can present elements toward the idea of a theory of philosophy, theory being something uncertain anticipates of science. He ends his first section by saying, quote, "That is how I ask you to understand my title, Lenin and philosophy. Not Lenin's philosophy, but Lenin on philosophy. In fact, I believe that we owe to Lenin something which is perhaps not completely unprecedented, but certainly invaluable to the beginnings of the ability to talk of a kind of discourse which anticipates what will one day perhaps be a non-philosophical theory of philosophy." Unquote. That wraps up section 1 and provides an outline for the project that Althusser is working on within the article. For the remaining 24 pages of the article, I do not feel enough to accurately cover many of the points. I do not feel confident enough to accurately cover many of the points. Instead, with the basis understanding towards the project, I'd like to outline several bullet points that I think will perhaps entice curiosity in looking more into the article or into thinking about this project in a new light. First, going into section 2, it is interesting in which way Lenin looks at philosophy, and for me it is beneficial to view it as in a new context. In another letter to Gorky, Lenin writes, "Not only do I not philosophize with their philosophy," talking about the Auschwitz again, "I do not philosophize like them at all. Their way of philosophizing is to expend fortunes of intelligence and subtlety for no other purpose than to ruminate in philosophy, whereas I treat philosophy differently. I practice it, as Marx intended, in obedience to what it is. That is why I believe I am a dialectical materialist." Here Lenin uses the word practice again, practice philosophy again, and Althusser jumps on it with a startling idea. He claims that it is the practice that makes Lenin and perhaps Marx so intolerable to academic philosophers, because through this practice we can see glimpses, like promises of an outline, of an objective knowledge of philosophy's mode of being. But the last thing philosophers and philosophy can bear is the idea of a theory, i.e. an objective knowledge of philosophy capable of changing its tradition and practice. Althusser sums it up nicely by laying out 2 reasons why philosophy cannot stand Lenin. First, it cannot bear the idea that it might have something to learn from politics or from a politician. And on the other hand, it cannot bear the idea that philosophy might be the objective of a theory, i.e. an objective knowledge. And for Althusser, this is what Lenin could represent. This is the practice of philosophy. In section 3, Althusser lays out this intolerability as perceived by philosophers in the simplest terms. What is the core of Marxist theory? A science of a philosophy? Is Marxism at heart philosophy? The philosophy of praxis? But what are the scientific claims made by Marx? Is Marxism, on the contrary, at heart is science, historical materialism, the science of history? And how does this fit with the idea of the practice of philosophy? For Althusser turns to Marx, ironically one of his more philosophical works, in his writings, the thesis on Feuerbach. Particularly, Althusser draws from the 11th thesis, where Marx says, "The philosophers have only interpreted the world in various ways. The point is to change it." This simple sentence seemed to promise a new philosophy, one which is no longer an interpretation, but rather a transformation of the world. It is this outlook that is drawn upon by later Marxist thinkers. Althusser specifically names Labriola and Gromowski. And Althusser claims this is the meaning of a philosophy of praxis, praxis P-R-A-X-I-S, meaning practice is distinguished from a theory, application and use of knowledge and skills. And I think this is very possible to see how this translates to Lenin's practice of philosophy as a theory. Continuing with the 11th thesis on Feuerbach, Althusser draws what this practice should look like. He says that even if thesis 11 announced an event which was to leave its mark on philosophy, it could not give rise to a philosophy, or rather had to proclaim the radical suppression of all existing philosophy in order to give priority to the work needed for the theoretical gestation of Marx's scientific discovery. And quoting Marx directly here in the German ideology, it is essentially to get rid of all philosophical fancies and turn it to the study of positive reality, to tear aside the veil of philosophy and at last see the reality for what it is. Althusser then sees this theoretical event as inaugurating the new science as an epistemological break, the kind discussed near the beginning of the paper. Althusser goes so far as to even outline what he calls continents, which he says are regional formations of science, where similar epistemological breaks have occurred. The first, he says, was mathematics by the Greeks, and the second, the continent of physics by Galileo and his successors. Marx then is the continent of history. So as you can see the way that Althusser puts on the idea of historical materialism, and he says this new science is materialist, but so is every science. So far, Althusser seems to be very much opposed to the idea of philosophy, but of course this is not true. And though the rest of the lecture, which I feel I do not have the opportunity to cover, does unify the two through a relation that is highly relevant and an engrossing read. However, he does point out philosophical standings with a relation near the end of the third section. He says that if philosophy is to be born or reborn, one or more sciences must exist. Again, pointing out this relationship. He quotes Hegel here in saying, philosophy takes wing at dusk when science, born at dawn, has already lived the time of a long day. Again, feeling this break or lag, as Althusser later titles it, between science and philosophy. Now quoting Althusser, he says, quote, philosophy is thus always a long day behind science, which induces the birth of its first form and the rebirth of its revolutions. A long day which may last years, decades, half a century, or a century. We should realize that the shock of a scientific break does not matter, does not make itself felt at once. That time is needed to reorganize philosophy. To wrap up quickly section 3, which much of this paper has been about, Althusser lays out 3 inferences we can take from these ideas. First, if Marx has opened a new continent to scientific knowledge, his discovery ought to induce some sort of important reorganization in philosophy, as stated in the beginning and throughout. Second, philosophy only exists by virtue of the distance it lags behind the science. Marxist philosophy should therefore lag behind the Marxist science of history. This does indeed seem to be the case, as Althusser says we are currently in long periods of dreadlock, periods which we and many others are still marking time. Third, there is a chance that we will find more advanced theoretical elements for the elaboration of Marxist philosophy than we might have expected, in that the lag of Marxist science giving the distance of the current gap. Althusser does quickly comment, I think rather interestingly, on the attempt of forcing of the creation of a Marxist philosophy that follows from this science. He looks at past Marxist worker movements and gives them a very critical name. He calls them theoretical deviations, which have led to great historical defeats for the proletariat. That of the Second International, to mention only one. These deviations are called economism, evolutionism, voluntarism, humanism, empiricism, and dogmatism. Here I'm going to inject some of my own thoughts real quick. It seems to me that Althusser is waiting not for the end of the lag, but in fact some sort of proto-Baduian event. And reading this has certainly struck me in a very odd way, having some knowledge of Badiou, which of course is not surprising given their relationship as student and teacher. The last lines of section 3 I find rather amusing, as Althusser says, in an attempt to refer back to Lenin and his relationship to all this. We surely owe this service and this homage to a man who was lucky enough to be born in time for politics, but unfortunate enough to be born too early for philosophy. After all, who chooses his birthday? He does actually make an interesting recount in section 4, though, that I think is rather interesting, and he says, let me anticipate my conclusion. No, Lenin was not born too soon for philosophy. No one is ever born too soon for philosophy. If philosophy lags behind, if this lag is what makes it philosophy, how is it ever possible to lag behind a lag which has no history? If we absolutely must go on talking of a lag, it is we who are lagging behind Lenin. Our lag is simply another name for a mistake, for we are philosophically mistaken about the relations between Lenin and philosophy. The relations between Lenin and philosophy are certainly expressed in philosophy, inside the game which constitutes philosophy, as philosophy. But these relations are not philosophical because this game is not philosophical. And that's basically, I got through the first part of it, and it goes on to a lot more that I felt like I just didn't have time to cover, so I'd like to actually go in and do another lecture on the rest of it. That would be great. But as for now, that is my lecture. It didn't cover Lenin as much as the ideas of philosophy around Lenin, but hopefully entertaining nonetheless.
All right. You gonna take questions?
Oh, no.
Okay. Sure.
Slow me through. That question takes you.
If the questions are gentle, yes, fire away.
Halfway through your speech, you were saying that I think Marx said, you don't, or philosophers don't change the world, they just interpret it. And somebody was refuting that, like halfway through speech. I don't know, I didn't catch the name. Is that, did I mishear you? Did I just,
Sorry.
did anybody else?
Good question.
I know what
It's
you're
pertaining to
talking about.
Marx's 11th thesis on Feuerbach.
And hitherto, all philosophers have only sought to explain the world, and the purpose is to change it.
Interpret, yeah. And the purpose is to change it, right. I didn't think I mentioned anyone who's specifically trying to recant that, at least not in that part. Okay.
Well,
sorry,
no, that's
unless
not
I
fine.
did.
Oh, Max.
Yeah.
Can I ask the context of the whole thing? Is just Althusser? Is this just him writing? Is this him having a dialogue with somebody?
This is just Lenin and philosophy is one lecture that's in here. There's a few others. This one is a paper that he just gave to a conference of leftists. I'm not actually sure who it was, but yeah,
Okay.
It was a paper given to a group of leftists.
That answers my question.
Yeah, I mean, it might be helpful to sort of situate Althusser historically. He's in the 19th century.
Wait, 19th, 20th?
Sorry. Yes, the 20th century, the 1900s. Basically, you have a whole lot of Frankfurt School going on, and a lot of just, oh yeah, we should really focus on how people are consuming products, how culture is being generated, and getting away from the orthodox Marxist-Leninism, because that just leads to Soviet tyranny, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah.
And Althusser is like, no, actually, we should just do that, and mostly just sort of tries to keep Leninism alive through that time period.
Was he associated with the Frankfurt School at all, aside from just
Loosely.
saying, you guys suck?
Here's the thing, in 60s continental Marxism, everyone's associated with the Frankfurt School.
Yeah.
Okay.
But that doesn't mean they don't take critical positions towards it.
Okay. Such is a position of Althusser.
Does Althusser go into how these deviations arise, or what the structure or context of these deviationists are?
He's talking about theoretical, in that it's people who are, from how he's saying it, people who are trying to force a philosophy rather than letting the philosophy catch up with the science, or the lag to end, essentially. And I think that if you looked at, I think that's kind of all he says about it. It's people trying to force the philosophy in not the right conditions, perhaps.
How does one go about forcing a philosophy in not the right conditions? Does he mention anything about that?
I have it marked in here somewhere. I have that section marked in here. I would have to find it. Let's see. All right, here's a thing that's fairly relevant, I think. He says, therefore Marxist theory being what it is, a science and a philosophy, and the philosophy having necessarily lagged behind the science, which has been hindered in its development by this. We may be tempted to think of these theoretical deviations, which is what I was looking for, were at bottom inevitable, not just because of the not just because of the effects of the class struggle on the theory, but also because of the dislocation inside the theory itself.
So that, if I understand you correctly, the science of history causes internal dislocation of the philosophical understanding of itself, and this internal dislocation leads to essentially necessary deviationists?
He says that we may call them inevitable. I don't know if he would say they're actually inevitable, but I think everything else, yeah, it would be fair to say. I mean, that's exactly how I would probably read it too. So, yeah.
So what constitutes the epistemic break?
this was one part that's in here a lot more than I covered because I was focused on some other things. It's mostly the transformation in which we find ourselves viewing or doing science in a different way. So it's, I mean, there's several examples. Anyway, from looking at science as a completely different way, or doing away with something like alchemy, from physics, you know, springing out of the school of philosophy or something like that. These all just constitute different ways of looking at a certain continent, which is a fractalized science.
So above and beyond a continent, is there anything that essentially structures these epistemic breaks, or are they merely arise out of the historical process?
I can't think of anywhere in particular that I would be able to answer that specifically. I would say probably, for what he's writing, probably they just arise out of the conditions that are met. But I suppose if you're looking at maybe Badiou, he would say they arise out of events. So.
You mentioned that Lenin sort of got invited to talk to these critico-empiricists who are mostly just sort of idealists in their own right. Did Althusser discuss their project for revolution out of Imperial criticism?
You know, he did a little bit, and it was mostly about trying to structure, just trying to change internally the way that the Bolsheviks looked at philosophy and things like that. Trying to add things like Imperial criticism and trying to do away with things like Materialism. He said some other things too. I mean, they went in trying to install religious organizations throughout the party to a point where a lot of them were called God makers by some people. So just things like that, just trying to change the party internally. I think he didn't go into tons about that yet.
Just historically speaking, if you're interested, Lenin writes this book called Criticism. I think it's called Marxism or Dialectical Materialism and Imperial Criticism.
Yeah.
Critics.
Yeah, I think he draws a lot from that book in here.
Do you have the exact name?
Let's see, Materialism and Imperial Criticism?
Yeah, that would be the one.
Yeah.
And basically in it, what he does is he goes through the various forms of imperial criticism, which are it's this sort of philosophical tradition, very similar, if those are familiar, with logical positivism. And so the basic idea is that you don't ever really experience anything in the world, you just experience your sensations of it. And what Lenin points out is, in that case, there is no actual real world. It's all just in your head, right, and just pure sensation. And so instead of, they view it as being a materialist project, right, because they only scientifically say what you actually sense. What Lenin points out is that this scientific theory abolishes the entire world and reduces everything down to just brute sensation, you know, in the mind.
Which scientific theory is that? Just scientific theory in general?
No, it's a specific form of, like it literally arose out of logical positivism. Are you at all familiar with that? Well,
Epistemological, like the study of how we know things,
Okay.
right? Going back at least as far as Descartes, as far as Plato.
yeah, and the main positivists were, I forget his first name. I think it's Emile Comte, not to be mistaken with Immanuel Kant. And then one of the big people who influenced these Russians were Macht. And Macht's position, again, was that you can only scientifically say about what you experience, and the only thing you can experience is sensation. So the only thing you can talk about is sensation. But again, Lenin takes it to task saying, no, if you say the only thing you can talk about is sensation, then everything is just in your head, and there's no actual world.
That's saying the same thing that the real world doesn't exist, only that your perception. The same seems to be. It doesn't exclude the existence of the real world. It only says that what you know is only your perception.
Well, here's where it goes further, right? They would also attack anyone who said that real objects exist, because what they would say is that's unscientific because you have no evidence that those objects exist.
But that doesn't mean they couldn't exist.
Yeah, but then in that case, you still shouldn't believe in them.
You're not dealing with objective truth and reality.
Yeah.
As to where like somebody like Kant comes along and sort of blends the rationalists with the empiricist and says, yeah, there's things in the world like chairs, but we only know that they exist insofar as they appear to us.
Right,
But we can't talk about the thing in itself, like what is the essence of a chair?
right.
And this is where Marx, for example, has a really big disagreement with Immanuel Kant, right? Because Immanuel Kant is an idealist, one of the first idealists, who says, you know, everything just appears in our head, everything is just structured in our head, we only know things from how we see them, right, phenomenologically, not the actual thing in itself. And what Marx says is, no, actually there's a real world, there's a material world, it's the material world that comes first, and our knowledge and consciousness arises out of that. And so, if you're friendly, if you want to be sympathetic to the Imperial criticists, or you want to be sympathetic to the analytic Marxists, which come about in the 60s and 70s, then what you say is, oh, well, what they're trying to do is apply the best they understand about science to materialism. But those who reject it, like myself, like Lenin, like Althusser, say, no, as a matter of fact, what you do is you reduce it to empty philosophizing, essentially about nothing. And Max, if you want.
No, I'm not.
You guys have any other questions for Max? Let's give him a hand and move on.